Did anyone, tell me if the volume gets wonky, did anyone go to the mountain climbing talk during lunch? So that she mentioned premortems, and at first I thought, oh, she stole my thunder. And then I realized if premortems are approved for life and deathy things like avoiding avalanches, then they're definitely good to use for QA. So let's jump into this. The only ground rule I have is when you're presenting, as the presenters out there know, you never know if you're going too slowly and boring people or going too quickly and losing people and making them feel dumb. So the only kind of way we can gauge that is ask questions. So interrupt at any time with questions. I'm totally open to that. One thing I want to do is summarize the whole talk in one slide. And let's do that right now, and then I'll explain why I've done that. Here's what a premortem is. It's really a basic concept. It's amazing that we're able to squeeze a whole 45-minute talk out of this concept, but we are, trust me. What you do when you're doing a premortem is you pretend that your project has failed, or if you're the mountain climber, you pretend that you've all perished in a avalanche. Number two, you ask, why did the project fail? Again, it's pretend, so it didn't actually fail. You pretend why it failed. And then you decide what you can do right now that'll prevent that from actually coming to pass. So why am I doing this unusual step of showing you the short attention span version of the talk? It's because these talks often consist of, here's a problem, and here's a solution to the problem. And you never quite know what order to present those in. So if you give the problem first, that makes sense, because otherwise, like, the solution is just confusing if you don't know what you're trying to address with the solution. On the other hand, if you get 2/3 of the way through the talk and you still haven't hit the solution, people are just confused. It builds suspense in a, not in a good Agatha Christie way, but in a like Battlestar Galactica reboot, what's going on kind of way. So I don't want to do that. So now you know what a premortem is. Well, let's backtrack and talk about what the problem is that premortems solve, and go into way more detail about how you can actually do a premortem. This is the agenda for today. Number one, why am I here? Which I should have rephrased this as what's the problem we're trying to solve. Number two, let me dig into some everyday English words that I realized I was confused about when I started thinking about premortems. And if I'm confused, maybe some of you are confused about them too. And it'll help to get a better sense of what those words mean before we go through the rest of this. Then I'm going to give you 11 very detailed steps on one way to conduct a premortem. This doesn't have to be the only way. There is no rigid format for how to do a premortem. This is a way that worked for me. You can use it as a starting point and adapt it to work for you. And then if time allows, which really just depends on how many questions you ask in the meantime, we'll talk about some extra stuff. But we'll skip that if time doesn't allow. So why am I here? What is the problem? Before I jump into this, you know when you go to like a site like the Wirecutter that recommends things, and you say, what is the best instant coffee I can buy? And then like half of the review is people bragging about their credentials for why they know so much about instant coffee or whatever the thing is that you're researching. This happens at talks too sometimes. This always struck me as kind of arrogant and weird, but I'm including a slide about this, about myself, for the opposite effect. I'm not an expert at premortems. And I don't want you to take what I say as gospel on premortems. Take it as a starting point. And you can adjust, as I said, the premortem process any way you want to make it work for you. So, my background. Yeah, as Henry said, I've been SDET around the Portland tech scene for a while. Has anyone here never worked on a failed project? That's what I thought. I've worked on lots of failed projects. And some of those projects would have been better off with premortems. Some of them failed despite premortems. I didn't invent premortems, like I said. As far as I can tell, the concept came into being about 10 years ago through a Harvard Business School journal article, whatever it's called, HBR review, something like that, HBS review. I don't know if they invented it either, or if they just popularized the term. It's not a very complicated concept, so maybe no one invented it. Maybe it's just a common sense thing that they slapped an actual name on. On the other hand, premortem is kind of an obvious name too. So it's possible no one invented these things. They just sprang into being. I found the premortems worked really well for me. When I've tried them at my companies, they've always added more value than they've spent, than they've detracted, than they've cost. So, but I'm not under the illusion that they'll work for all people in all cases. So they're not a silver bullet. But if they work for me, maybe they'll work for you too. I've also discovered that you can do them at any point along the formal to casual spectrum. You can have a very rigid process that everyone knows about, or you can just talk about a premortem over lunch with a bunch of people. Both work, but I've got a double greater than sign here because I've found formal processes work way better in general, in my experience again, than casual banter. So you might want to start with that and see how it goes. I'm genuinely interested in how these work for you. So if you give them a try, let me know. Twitter confuses me. Facebook terrifies me. I don't even know what Instagram is. So email is the best way to reach me if you have any feedback on this, either on the presentation or on whether premortems work for you. And I'll put that email address up again at the end. Here's the problem premortems are meant to address. Projects fail all the time for foreseeable reasons. We should have seen it coming, but we didn't. So the project failed. Does anyone recognize this snippet, this format? Anyone seen that layout before?
Yeah.
What's that, Yelp? It's similar, yeah. It's from Metacritic. Anyone use Metacritic?
Sure, yeah.
So it consolidates reviews of movies and albums and books and computer games. And this is a screen capture from the Metacritic page on a game called No Man's Sky, which came out about a year ago. The kids were all excited about it. It had all sorts of hype. It got tons of pre-publicity before the thing came out, and then the thing came out and it was a disaster. It was terrible. I never played it. Maybe it was fine. I don't know. But 2.6 on a scale of 10 looks pretty bad to me. So the reason I bring this up is, as far as I can tell from reading reviews of No Man's Sky, they could have predicted this. There are a lot of things they could have fixed in advance had they thought carefully about this. And I think something like No Man's Sky is a perfect use case for a premortem. Another way, and I promise this is the last medical analogy I'm going to use in this presentation. Originally, every slide was medical, but it just got ridiculous, so now none of them are. Vaccinate your project against failure is kind of the catchphrase you can use when you're trying to justify a premortem to your manager. Okay, let's define the terms. So this next section of defining these English terms is going to feel like I'm insulting your intelligence, and I promise I'm not. These are words that I thought I knew what they meant, and then as I thought about them, trying to put this presentation together, I realized I wasn't completely sure in all cases what all these words mean. After I thought about them, they got clear, and now I get it, and you'll all get it too. There's nothing complicated, but we should go through them. Before we get started, who remembers this? We all remember this, unfortunately. Okay, so let's just move right along. Okay, what is a premortem? This is the best short description I'm able to come up with. It's a formal, meaning there's a process, risk identification, and mitigation, process. So now let's zoom in and enhance on some of these words. Let's start with risk. What do we really mean by risk? Now, risk is one of those words that everyone in software uses all the time, but I'm convinced it's used sloppily by a lot of people. It was used sloppily by me. I didn't really think hard about it. But QA in particular talks about risk nonstop, right? It's all risk, 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 with occasionally throwing in the word mitigation, which we'll get to also. So what is risk? I think risk is anything that might reduce a project's success. Does this sound reasonable? I actually wonder, are there better definitions here that anyone wants to propose? Yeah.
There's an element of uncertainty in risk.
There's an element of uncertainty. Yes. Right. Okay. I don't know how to work that in, but that's a good point. You're right. It feels like there's some uncertainty. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Rather than reduce, I would suggest that risk. I would actually use stronger word than reduce. I would use something like obstruct.
Obstruct, meaning prevent any success at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of times when we go through, when I think about a given, say, feature or software feature, and I think about, and we start brainstorming what risks there would be, and when I'm responsible for, say, writing a test plan, and I list out my risks, there are going to be things that are preventative that actually accomplish a goal, which is successful delivery of the project. that might just be my particular experience.
Okay. I'm going to repeat that just for the camera's sake. The comment was that sometimes reduce might seem like too loose of a word, not too loose, too weak of a word, and what we really mean by risk is anything that could completely prevent a project success. So a more binary, it either works or doesn't kind of approach. Yeah?
I don't know, I would say it would impact project success because you could be underestimating how much people are going to want your product. The one time that might happen, but you may be unprepared to support that or able to get more features in, and then at that point,
Okay, so that comment was, it might, sorry, what was the key word used? Impact. Yeah, a risk is something that might impact a project success, even if it's in the sense of, hey, this project is way more successful than we expected, and we can't keep up with the demand because our servers can't handle the load. Is that what you were kind of pointing at? Okay. All right, anything that might affect a project success. How about that? They would be more generic. Let's zoom in further on anything. What do we mean by anything? What are some things that might qualify? These are just things I came up with, but an event. You've got a server that catches on fire. Doesn't happen very often, but that definitely would affect some kind of physical event with hardware would affect your project success. People events, people quit, people get into arguments, people stop working well together. Or we've all seen this, requirements change halfway through the project. So these are all things that can happen that I think would qualify as risks. Another kind of risk type would be a person. Some people just aren't very good at their job and you're stuck with them for whatever reason. You've got to work around them, or you've got to find, incompetence a mean word here, but someone whose skill set doesn't match what's required in the task, by the task. So you've got to work around them or find some way of complementing their skill set with someone else's, or find some other task they can work on. These are all things that take time and effort and mental energy and potentially affect the outcome of your project. You can get people who are just stubborn. We've all worked with these folks. They refuse to accept direction. They think everything you say is wrong. There's only one way they know how to do things, and that's the only way that they're going to do things. That can really slow down a project and affect your success. Or people who are just negative. We've also worked with these folks, unfortunately. Nothing is right, everything is wrong, and they drag down the morale of the whole team because they just are unhappy about the world. I have been all of those people at some time, so I'm not trying to cast too many aspersions here. You can have cultural elements that count as something that could affect the success of a project, the cultural risks. You can have a small group that takes on a more competitive attitude rather than a collaborative attitude. I'll stop saying we've all worked with this kind of thing before because that applies to every single bullet on these slides, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. You can have a skeptical culture. I can't tell you how many times CEOs in every company I've ever worked with have said, you need to take, what do they say, have good faith in your colleagues, your coworkers. Assume they are doing good work. Don't question everything they do. Let them do their jobs and accept that what they come up with is okay. If you get too skeptical, you stop doing that and it can slow everything down. And then the fast and sloppy Wild West, code first, ask questions later approach that a lot of companies have, especially in startup mode. These are all major risks as far as I'm concerned. Constraints, so the old not enough time constraint, the not enough people constraint that we all know so well, the technical decisions imposed by a pointy-haired boss who doesn't know what he or she is talking about. We've all run across these. They're all a pain in the neck, and we all have to work with them. Technology can be a constraint. You're told to use a library, or you choose to use a library, third-party library, and it doesn't quite do what you think it's going to do, or it's buggy. And then you face the question of, should we fork it and fix it and maintain our own fork? No, that's a terrible idea. Then what do we do? I don't know. Sometimes you have third-party libraries that don't play nicely with each other. They don't quite do what the other one expects. Or you've got some service that you rely on that doesn't do exactly what you want, and you burn incredible amounts of time trying to work around what it does do. In the end, you throw it away and build your own, and that's a disaster too. So here's an example of technology. Does anybody, technology as a risk? Does anybody recognize this? This is real. I didn't make this up. Give you a hint. It's not APL. I don't know what APL is, but look at that. Does that tell you anything? This is a snippet of an actual configuration file from SendMail, which, now granted, SendMail is often held up as an example of the hardest to use software, major open source software package ever written, and this is why. So if you got a boss who says, guess what, team, you're going to use SendMail on this project, you got to grapple with this. This is a serious risk, as far as I'm concerned. I have no idea what that does. Also, this was like 10% of the whole file that I found online. Imagine 9 times more of that. All right. Okay, the last category of risks that I could think of is lack of knowledge. And I really think of 2 ways you can have lack of knowledge. You can have known unknowns, such as, hey, we don't really know what this JSON parsing library does. We should spend a day doing a research spike and making sure we understand what it does before we go all in on it. That's something you can deal with. What's harder to deal with are the Donald Rumsfeld style unknown unknowns. And remember how much flack he took when he came up with the 4-part distinction of known unknown? It was totally unfair. I mean, he's obviously a horrible human being, but that was a really useful distinction. Unknown unknowns are a great concept that we all owe him a debt of thanks for introducing us to. These are the silent killers in projects because there's only so much you can do about them. You can't, sometimes going through the premortem process, you will convert some of these unknown unknowns into this category, into known unknowns. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get 80% of the way through the project, the whole thing grinds to a halt because of something you never anticipated, and there's no clear way out. That doesn't happen very often, but it certainly happened to me, and it's probably happened to some of you. And I don't have a lot of advice on how to get around this. So premortems will sort of help, but they won't solve it entirely. Okay, let's sort of bubble back up a layer. We defined risk as anything. We just looked at anything. We zoomed in on anything. Now let's zoom in on reduce. And this is going to your comment earlier. What do we mean by reduce? I really think reduce, sorry, I'm going to say exactly the opposite of what you said. I think it can be all sorts of, it doesn't have to be a catastrophic collapse. I think you could reduce the success of your project by having to be half as successful as it might have been. So take No Man's Land, or No Man's Sky, sorry. That game did sell copies. I don't know if they made money or lost money, but it sold copies. Not everybody hated it. Some people maybe had fun playing it. It was not a complete catastrophe. It certainly wasn't as successful as it could have been. So I would consider that an example of reducing the success of a project. Let's zoom in on what we mean by mitigation. This is a word that we all throw around a lot, and it was the word that I was least clear on. I think mitigation, after thinking about it a little bit, is a small expense now that prevents a big expense later. Does that sound reasonable? I captured it more or less. So some examples, like obviously any kind of insurance, health insurance, car insurance, whatever. That's a perfect example. You pay some money now, you avoid paying a whole lot of money later on, is the theory. Or a simpler example, an umbrella. It's a hassle to carry an umbrella, you got to buy it, but you're glad you have it when you've got it. And this is the key thing that I forgot, and that my managers always forget, is that mitigation is never free. Well, usually not free. When they say, all right, Chris, what's your risk mitigation plan? And you say, well, my plan is going to take 2 people, or 4 person days to put into effect, and they squawk and they look confused. They're forgetting that mitigation is not free in most cases. It's also a weird word. Why don't we just say risk reduction? Why do we say mitigation? Why don't we say minimization? That's a common word. I mean, we never use mitigation in any other concept other than risk, right? Comment?
I think it's because we don't have a guarantee that we can minimize the risk or guarantee that we can. Mitigating means that we have a process or a plan or a course of action. There's no guarantee it's going to work.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
In many fields, the risk mitigation would be a term for reducing the impact of the risk when it occurs, whereas risk reduction is reducing the likelihood that the risk will occur.
That's great. That I was unaware of. So mitigation, to repeat the comment, in many fields, mitigation reduces the impact of a risk, and risk reduction reduces the likelihood of the thing happening. So that's a concept other people are familiar with? Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Anyway, for the sake of this slide, I'm going to stick with my original point, which is that mitigation is a word we only ever use with risk, which makes no sense to me, and we should use one of these other words like risk shrinking or risk alleviation. So this is the only conclusion I can reach, and I'm really glad that I got English for free and don't have to struggle with learning it like the rest of the world just because they want to watch Baywatch reruns or whatever. So the dumbness of English is one of my favorite topics, so I'm going to detour for 30 seconds and stay on it for a second. My kids asked me the other day, why is T-O-M-B pronounced that way and W-O-M-B pronounced exactly the same way? But you'd think this would be boom, right? It should be boom, obviously, but it's not. And then comb just throws a spanner in the works and is a third pronunciation. So it really makes no sense. And if we were to do a pre-mortem on English, I would say the spelling and pronunciation are so insane that it's never going to catch on, except maybe in like dusty ivory tower academics by English literature professors, and we should all be speaking Esperanto. I don't know why we aren't. Okay, how are we doing on time? We are doing okay. Let's jump into what a premortem really is. Step 1, this is 11 steps. Sorry it's so many, but it's a simple concept. I had to stretch it out to make it fill the time of the talk. But I think these are all legit. Yes, they're all legit. So the first thing you need to do is decide the scope of your premortem effort. So are we going to do a premortem on the entire project? Well, if it's a small project, sure. If it's an enormous project that's going to take 2 years and involve 50 people, that's going to be harder to do, and you might not want to bite off that much as a first attempt at a premortem. Although if you're an experienced premortemer, sure, why not? Go for it. Some other options are you can just look at one feature of the project and just do a premortem on that, which is kind of what I've done most often is let's just have QA people do a premortem on the QA side of a project. What are the ways where QA might fall down on the job here? What are ways the bugs might slip through? So not think about how the whole project could fail, but how could QA as part of the project fail? And that's actually worked pretty well. You don't normally hear premortems run that way. Usually they're covering a whole project, but I don't think there's any reason to do it, to do a whole project. You can do a portion. You also need to figure out certain logistics. So who is going to participate? Premortems are not free. They do take some time. And if you have a 20-person team, you probably don't want to involve all 20 people because it's just expensive. 20 people times 3 hours times their salary is a lot. I made up the 3 hours. It's going to vary a little bit. You can use a subset of a team. Like you could do just the QA people if you wanted. That's what I've done, and it's worked well. Then you have to decide, do we want our premortem activities to be synchronous or asynchronous? By which I mean, do you want a bunch of people in one room or maybe across a video conference, all doing these steps at the same time? Or do you want to do it by email or whatever your corporate communication system is in bits and pieces, spread out over, say, a week? They both work. I only have experience. Actually, I shouldn't say they both work. I have no idea if asynchronous works. I've never tried it. I've only tried synchronous, and it seems 100 times easier than asynchronous to me and more effective, but maybe asynchronous is fine. You also have to decide, are we just, this is similar to the asynchronous debate, but not exactly the same. Are we just going to involve local people if you're geographically distributed? Or are we going to haul in those people who are in Bratislava or Tokyo or whatever as well, even though you've got time zone differences and other headaches? I've only done local, but I don't see why you couldn't do remote. Anyway, you got to decide these things. And then once you've decided them, this seems either like blatantly obvious. Of course you'd tell everyone who's doing the premortem how to do a premortem. Or not everyone sees the value in this. For example, me. The first time I did this, I didn't send out instructions, and it was a terrible mistake. Because number one, everyone thought premortems were dumb. And so they had no idea really what it was. And all they knew is it was new and different, therefore stupid. And also because there was sort of a complicated process of doing these, and if people were unfamiliar with the steps involved, I had to explain them as we went. There were a lot of questions. It went very slowly, so it took much longer than it needed to. So I really recommend you send out not only instructions on here's how we're going to do it, and here are the logistical decisions that we've already made, but also an explanation of what the value of a premortem is, because odds are your team's never done one before, and they might be skeptical of the value. So anything you can do to increase buy-in before the process even gets started is great. I think sending instructions and justification is a good way to do that. explain process, speeds things up, yep, and increases buy-in. Got those all covered. Okay, here's where it starts getting fun. You imagine your project failing. The first thing you have to ask is, what do we mean by failure? Like, what are some of the things that failure might look like for our particular project? And every project is going to be capable of failing in different ways. Also, failure could look different to different people. So failure to a customer might look very different than failure to a DevOps engineer who's keeping this thing up and running. Might be very different than failure to, say, the CFO who's looking at the impact your project makes on the company's bottom line. So try to keep all those perspectives in mind. Obviously, whatever you're most experienced with, whatever your role is the primary lens you'll use when thinking about failure. But try to imagine other people's perspectives as well. You also want to consider partial versus complete failure. We talked about this a little bit with the way in which No Man's Sky was kind of a partial failure, not a complete failure. Most projects have ways of not fully collapsing. There are also minor versus disaster grade failures you can think about. What would a minor failure look like? This is similar. These two bullets are similar. Once you've imagined what failure looks like, this is the meat of the thing. You brainstorm reasons for failure. What are the various things that might have caused this failure? And don't filter anything at this point. So every person should come up with one list. So you do this in isolation. The idea is you don't want to be influenced by someone else. Well, so what someone else is thinking. We want everyone to bring their own unique perspective, their own unique background in seeing other kinds of failures in other jobs to the table. Everyone come up with their own list of reasons that this project might fail.
So up
yeah.
to this point, have you defined specifically what the failure is, and so the brainstorming reasons is for that particular failure?
Well, you want to. So on this step, you want to think about what are all the different ways it might fail.
Okay.
So we're not concentrating just on one.
Okay.
There might be 30 different ways it could fail. Some minor, some big.
It's not really failure, right? You're just imagining where your project could go wrong. It might not be catastrophic failure.
That's right. It could just be reduced success. So partial failure, partial minor failure. Maybe failure is the wrong word, but anything you can imagine that reduces the success of your project. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Pamela?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So now we've all talked about the ways in which our project can fail. Now we each individually brainstorm ways that we think it might fail. And it's really important to do this individually. So that, like, if I list something and I notice you don't have it on your list, I'm not going to feel like sheepish about, well, maybe it's not a real reason, right? Just get all the ideas out there. Don't filter on anything like likelihood or severity or difficulty mitigation. Don't worry about that. Just throw everything out here. We'll do the filtering later. So if your worry is a meteor might come in and destroy our data center, put it on there. We'll take it off later, but put it on for now. No filters, and the meteor case we talked about. Okay, so now we've got a bunch of different lists of possible reasons that the project will fail. Now we'll consolidate them into a big master list. So we've got one huge list now, and the first thing that we need to do is deduplicate, because if we're all good at our jobs, we'll have a lot of duplicates. We also need to clarify. So I might say this thing is a possible reason the project will fail, and it might not make any sense to someone else who's never run into that before. We found when I ran premortems, this took a lot of time to get everyone understanding what all the reasons were. Sometimes they just didn't have experience in that area, so you just had to kind of spell it out a little bit. Also, sometimes when you clarify, you come up with new ideas. Or someone else might say, oh yeah, I didn't think of that idea that you listed, that makes me think of this other thing. So keep adding to the list as you go. But at this point we have just one big list. It's really important to time box this step, because otherwise the bike shedding can go on for weeks. Don't spend more than, 2 hours, 1 hour, whatever seems reasonable to you. Now we filter. And there are a lot of ways we could, when I say filter, I mean remove things from the master list, things that we're just not going to worry about. If something has a really low impact, someone said, what if IT forces us all to change our system passwords? That might slow us down. Well, yeah, it might by 2 minutes, and then we're just, we're back in the saddle and going. So we decided that was a low impact risk that we weren't going to worry about. You can throw away the low impact risks. Something that's incredibly unlikely to happen, you can throw away. I don't know, some service you rely on might have a maintenance window at a crucial time, and hey, that could be a hassle for us. Well, if that service has never had a maintenance window other than at 2 a.m., it's probably not going to happen now. So you probably have better things to worry about. Something that's totally out of your control, like the meteor case, good luck with that. There's nothing you can do, so you might as well remove that. If you have concerns that are too vague, they're not actionable, then you're probably going to want to go back and refine those or throw them away, one or the other. You want these things all to be something that you can try to mitigate somehow. And it's best to have the whole group filter by consensus. The reason for that is I might think of something as low impact or low likelihood, but someone else might say, no, I was in the job previously where exactly that happened. In fact, happened multiple times, and then I've learned something new, and we decide to keep it around as an actual risk. So it's best to use consensus. If you can't because of geographical distribution or time zone problems, then do the best you can. Okay, this is sort of a trivial slide, but I think it's psychologically important. At this point, we like to change our terminology. So in the process, we stop talking about reasons that this imaginary project failed, or reasons that this project imaginarily failed, and we start talking about actual real risks to the real project. Doesn't really matter. You can use these terms interchangeably, but I found it useful to kind of cement in people's minds the idea that we're moving now in the process from pretend backward looking to real forward looking.
So, real quick before we move on.
Yeah.
One thing that we've done in your previous filter stuff
Mhm.
is to graph, make a 2D axis of impact versus likelihood. Everybody throws it up on the graph where they think it is, and then you have kind of the project.
That is a genius idea that I would steal if I had a pen, but I'll remember it later. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great idea. We didn't do that. I wish we had. Now you vote. So the whole group thinks about what they think are the top risks. And different people are going to have different ideas on what they think the top risks are, and that's great. We want that. We want different perspectives, different experiences with things failing in the past. And there are lots of ways you can do this voting. You might decide everyone vote for 3 things, or you might decide everyone vote for 5 things, or you could be more complicated if you want. So everyone has 10 points. Distribute them any way you want, and then the top point getters, are the move to the top. There's no perfect way to do this, so experiment, I think, is the best approach. Once you've voted, you move all the top vote getters up to the top. And where are we here? Last thing you do, second to last thing, is action items to mitigate these risks. If you don't get to this step, there's no point doing any of the rest of it, as far as I can tell. We've all been in meetings where you decide as a group, thank you, you all decide as a group to do some very important thing. We got to re-swizzle the dilithium crystals ASAP or whatever it is, and then no one gets assigned the task, or someone does get assigned the task but no due date gets assigned, and guess what, the dilithium crystals never get re-swizzled. And so why did we even have that meeting? And because premortems are not free, they do take a fair number of person hours. It's extra important to get value out of them by coming up with action items. How many action items? Totally up to you. Depends on how many people you have to implement the action items, how much time you have before the project is going to ship, how disastrous it would be if the project failed. Maybe it's proof of concept, no one cares if it fails. Maybe there's some natural breakpoint where if you look at the list, the ordered list of risks, it just seems obvious that the first 7 all we really need to deal with, and then beyond 7 we don't really care. So it's going to vary in different cases, but see if there's a sensible way of doing it. Equally important is assigning owners to every action item. We all know what happens when an action item doesn't get an owner, or even worse, gets 2 owners, because then you're like, there's twice the chance it'll get done. No, that's not how it works. It'll probably never get done. And set due dates, of course, as I've already said. Action items are the whole point of this. I'm going to try to drill this into your heads because this is the most important slide. Is this the most important slide? No, I have a red version of this slide coming later. The red version is the most important one. This is the second most important slide in the whole thing. Action items are, now look, just to cement it further, I'm going to show you all the different ways you can make action items. Here's Jira. You can make an action item in Jira. You could do it in Trello. Does anyone use Trello anymore? Yeah, it's not totally dead. Good. Trello's pretty cool. Text file. Why not? Do it in text file. You can do comments in code. You could assign a task to a Google Doc, which then they'll never look at. You could do it in Slack. Is Slack totally taken over everybody's office like it has ours? I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you're not using Slack in your office. Oh, okay, so like half of you are not using Slack. Okay. Here's the red one. This is the most important slide. It's really important. Got to do the action items. And then just to beat a dead horse, there's a boy band in New Jersey called Action Item. And none of them look happy. This guy just wants to cry, doesn't he? He's like, why didn't I become an Oracle DBA and follow my dreams? He's got rolled up blazer sleeves. Who does that anymore? Okay, so here's some actual, these are actual action items from a real project I worked on. And don't worry about absorbing all of them. That's not the point. The point is I wanted to point out a few things about these action items and assignments. So one thing is, you notice we've got an orange action item, 2 red ones. The red ones are at the top of our list. The orange one was farther down. We found it useful to color code these things, red, orange, green, based on priority, so we knew where to focus our time and effort. Second thing is we've got some risks here that we're parallelizing the work on, the action items. So we've got 2 people working on these. That's fine. You can do that. Also, we've got a number of different types of action items. So some of these are Jira tickets. Some of them are just, hey, here's something you got to do. Add this thing to an agenda. Here as a discussion topic you want to add to, Fong's going to add to his one-on-one. So there are a lot of different ways you can convert an action item. You can specify an action item, and they're all good and useful. The cynic in me also wants to point out that if the project fails anyway, these formally recorded action items are a great CYA maneuver, so that QA can say, look, QA acted professionally, or the whole team, if it's not just QA. The whole team acted professionally in a way to reduce risk as much as we could. It failed anyway, but we're not entirely to blame because, look, we did the right thing. And your manager will appreciate that too when your manager is trying to justify your team's utter failure to your manager's manager. So I think this is really a pretty useful professional maneuver. Once you've got the action items assigned, you've got to track them. Again, using any technique you want, really doesn't matter. If you don't track them, they just will never get done. In summary, here are the 11 steps. Decide the scope, decide logistics, send instructions out, imagine failure, brainstorm reasons for failure, make a master list, filter out the ridiculous things or the things that you really can't worry about, vote on what's most important to you, reorder them so the top vote getters are on top, make action items, track action items. And like do the action items is implied. I guess that's part of track. Okay, timing wise, I've forgotten when we started. Oh, we have like 4 minutes.
Yeah.
I can either take questions or I can go through the extra stuff. Of course. Of course, yeah. Go ahead and repeat. Actually, no, I've got the mic. Let me. He said that when he did premortems, they made a grid with, was it likelihood and impact? So each risk, each possible reason the thing failed, they graphed in terms of how likely is it to happen and how big an impact would it have. And that helped them determine which ones they wanted action items for. Did I summarize that correctly? Okay.
Like DFMBA.
DFMBA? What's that?
You were going to ask me what it was, but it's basically the same thing where you get together and you talk about the risks and the likelihood they'll happen. And it's one times the other, give it a score.
Oh yeah, right. Yes, that's a risk analysis.
Analysis, something or other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Effective analysis.
Okay, I didn't know that had a term. That's good to know. Yeah. Let me spin through these a little bit. Reasons that you might not want to do a Premortem, number one, let's say it's a proof of concept, risks are low, or the impact, who cares if it fails? That's what I'm trying to say. It's probably not worth doing a premortem. If you don't know what counts as success, it's hard to know what counts as failure. So, and we've all been in situations where like, I don't know when this project is done. Well, if you don't know when it's done, you probably don't know when it's failed. So you might need to go back to the product owner or your manager or whatever and get more detail on that. Or if this is something you've done a million times before, you know exactly where all the potholes are. You're not going to hit them. You've jumped over them before. Don't worry about a premortem. It's too expensive. If you have a really huge team, a premortem might be prohibitively expensive. On the other hand, you can work around that by just using chunks of the team, a subset of the team in the premortem. That's fine. Premortems don't guarantee anything. Just like eating kale and wearing sunscreen doesn't guarantee you'll live to 100. They do shift the odds. Every bite of kale you have shifts the odds a little bit. And next year we'll discover kale is carcinogenic. I don't know. But premortems help, right? They can't hurt. Think of it that way. They can't hurt. So they're just shifting the odds. Don't make any promises you can't keep to managers on the basis of your premortem, is what I'm trying to say. They do get cheaper and better with practice. There are a lot of the same pitfalls across all projects or across several projects. And so when you do your second or third premortem, you might be like, oh, how about those 7 risks we identified last time? Let's just copy those over because they're the same. Like low morale is like always a problem for everybody, for every project. And the Pareto Principle. Who knows the Pareto Principle? Yeah, it's the 80-20 rule. This is Pareto, the Italian economist who discovered that, what was it, 80% of Italy's land was owned by 20% of Italians in the late 1800s. He didn't invent the principle, but it was named after him. If you can only do 20% of any of these things, that'll get you 80% of the way there. So if you can identify 20% of the risks, great. If you can only follow up on 20% of the action items, fine. That's better than nothing. These are big wins, even if you only do a little bit of a premortem. And I think, fringe benefits is boring. These are just all the nice things that can come from, we're out of time, so I'm going to skip through this. And then that's my email address if you have any either thoughts about how this has worked for you or follow-up questions. I'm happy to converse via email. Thank you.